Yes, 2 o'clock. Let's start, just on time. Very welcome to this afternoon session, and I'm very happy to be able to welcome Artsiom Holub from Cisco. He's a Senior Security Analyst with Cisco Umbrella Intelligence, Threat Intelligence team it is, yeah. And it's always nice to have an umbrella, Cisco, otherwise, especially in this rainy city. There'll be 5 minutes opportunity for questions and answers in the end of the presentation. But take it away, Artsiom.
Hello, everybody, and welcome, everyone. Thank you all for coming. As moderator mentioned, I work for Cisco Umbrella as a Senior Security Analyst on the Threat Intelligence team. And today I'll talk about a few recent attacks where the end result was ransomware. And we'll talk about where DNS was involved in these attacks and how we can use that knowledge to improve our security using DNS as an additional layer of security. So to start, we want to talk about the data gathering. So in this example, the perfect place to collect data is within the recursive DNS. In the case with getting data from the recursive DNS, we will work with 2 data sets. One will be coming from our users, sending the queries to the recursive DNS server, and the second one will be from upstream authoritative servers. With first data set, we have the opportunity to identify compromised systems, command and control callbacks, and so on. We also can write specific algorithms to identify some specific data that we want to identify with our observations. With the second data set, we can get insights into newly staged malicious infrastructures and the malicious components that actors use to attack the networks. So today the main focus will be the DNS tunneling adoption by quite few malicious actors and the different utilization of this technique both for command and control and data exfiltration. So DNS tunneling isn't entirely new technique. It's been around for quite a while. It's been used for legitimate purposes. However, what we worry about as the network owner is something like IT policy avoidance, guest Wi-Fi abuse, or some similar activities. But what even more important is that we witness an increase in use of this technique by multiple threat actors in the ransomware space. They were involved in high-profile attacks, including supply chain compromise, as well as ransomware. So whenever we talk about using DNS as a covered channel for either command and control communication or data exfiltration, we talk about data encoding. Data can be encoded in multiple ways and transferred through DNS channel in probably a million different variations. And that's the exact reason why it's not easy to detect with common security controls. It's highly customizable and thus requires somewhat complex approaches in detection. So in a few examples that I showed you, we've seen that the same data was encoded in either long subdomains of the domain which controlled by malicious attacker, or smaller chunks of the smaller subdomains, but exactly same data was exfiltrated both in the first and the second examples. So let's actually look at some of the recent ransomware attacks that I personally dealt with. Ransomware today is greatly different from ransomware from 5-6 years ago. At that time, ransomware actors just used, mail spam with direct access to the ransomware payloads, and the goal was to infect as many users and then get, as many payments as possible. However, recently it changed greatly to a more sophisticated, kind of like APT-style approach. Today, ransomware is a result of the multi-stage attack. And if we look at the schema, we see that DNS involved in many places of this attack. DNS tunneling can be involved in many stages of the attack. We've seen it being used for initial access by the loaders, and we've seen it being used by the post-exploitation framework. And I think the utilization of the Cobalt Strike framework in recent attacks give a big bump to the use of this technique by malicious actors. So in the first example, we will look at the ChachiRed. It has been observed to deliver PISA, aka Mespinoza ransomware. It actually utilizes two protocols for C2 communication. One is HTTP-based IP command control channel, and second one is DNS. However, the primary channel that it relies on is actually DNS tunneling, which uses TXT queries. TXT, or text records, were originally intended to allow domain owners to add additional data within the DNS request, such as domain ownership or network or server information. And since you can pack somewhat large amount of data in this record, it started being utilized by malicious actors over and over. So Chachi is pre-configured with a list of C2 domains, as well as IP addresses for failover HTTP CNC protocol. The domains are encoded in obfuscated binary, and the dedicated function will carry out XOR deobfuscation to identify the domain through the round of random seed challenge. So when the domain is identified, Chachi can now initiate a connection to a C2 infrastructure. Rather than implement the completely new DNS tunneling protocol for the purpose of communication, malicious actors used off-the-shell DNS-based reverse shell component, which called ChaShell. However, they are not using it completely as it comes off the shell. They modified it because they all know that, one way we build our defenses is that we look at the open source tools or off-the-shell tools that let us do something like a reverse shell, and then a lot of the companies and security products will have that detection built in by default. However, if you modified it, if you modified it, it becomes a lot more complex, and it's different enough to bypass those origin detections. So now ChaShell operates as the command and control channel rather than reverse shell itself. And the way it does it is that all of the data that malicious actor want to send back and forth is serialized into the protocol buffers before encrypting using the symmetric encryption. This encrypted data is then hex encoded and packed into the TXT query. The response to the TXT query is also subject to the protocol buffer serialization, encryption, and hex decoding. So another thing that ChachiRed authors modified within the ChaShell is that parts of the message that they use to operate as a command and control channel. So the main point of this particular message is the chunk data. Those are the messages that will be encoded prior to serialization of the data into a protocol buffer. And it will be performed in two steps. Step one will involve base 64 encoding the data, and then it will be passed to the function that performs XOR encoding using a hard-coded string. So you can imagine that with this approach, the end result that we see on the wire as the DNS request going back and forward looks just like some kind of DGA-based, not necessarily command and control, but from a lot of the advertising networks, things like CDNs, the way data is encoded is very similar. So without knowing what actually is encoded within that string, it's really hard to determine if that's some kind of malicious communication or just regular communication by one of the browsers trying to fetch information from one of the CDNs. However, in the end result of the PISA, of the ChachiRed activity, is the PISA or Mespinoza ransomware payload. So next thing is the timeline of the quantum ransomware. In this case, it started with someone in the affected network opening a mail spam which contained an iced ID loader. And as we can see, it took only 4 hours for the malicious actor to initially identify that their payload was executed, then get into the network, establish the access, get through the entire network via lateral movement, identify the information they needed to launch the encryption, and within 4 hours the quantum ransomware was deployed and took the entire network hostage. What's important on this slide is that we can see that the Cobalt Strike framework was used in multiple parts of the attack chain. It was used as a command and control, by the command and control to be injected into the network, and then it was executed on the server where it performed both lateral movement and the end operation payload, which was a quantum ransomware. And the reason why we see Cobalt Strike being used quite a lot is the possibility of the DNS-based beaconing. Their DNS-based beaconing isn't different from what you would expect from the DNS tunneling operation. It starts with the infected machine, which sends a DNS request to the local DNS server, and then it goes upstream up to the point where it reaches the server controlled by the actor. When the actor got their beaconing out to their server, they pretty much have the full control of the endpoint, and then they can carry out all kinds of malicious activities. But what we usually see is that profiling of the network comes first. So they want to identify what kind of network they have access to. Second one is, depending on what kind of network the tools will be deployed. A lot of the tools are embedded within the Cobalt Strike framework. And then when they identify all of the weak points of the network, they perform the lateral movement, they exfiltrated the data to use it in the double extortion schemas, which means that even if you don't want or you can't pay for the decryption of data, or you have really good IR and backup solutions, you still can lose the data that the malicious actor got access in the first place, and then the data can be either weaponized against your company or against that affected network, or it can be sold on the darknet forums for monetization purposes. Within the last 2 years, from the ransomware attacks I witnessed, we identified that 78% of them were using Cobalt Strike framework. In most of them, DNS beaconing was utilized. And the reason is that, once again, there is like no HTTP-based communication, so it directly bypasses a lot of the security controls. Second is that the beacon can be configured with malleable C2 configuration. So you can deploy multiple beacons within the same within the same network, right? And see which ones were actually blocked, so they never got out to the team server, or the ones that actually got out. So when you see the one that actually made it, you know what kind of encoding or malleable C2 configuration you need to use to carry out the rest of your malicious activity. So next we want to have a good understanding of how the beacon is configured. So the start of it will be the type of the payload, and we see that this is a DNS-based beaconing. The second one is the malicious domain, which actor actually has the full control of. And then we have a set of different configurations that can be used by the malicious attacker, depending on which ones are more or less likely to be detected within the network. So this is an example of the malleable C2 configuration. As we can see, the different settings for those fields that I mentioned on the last slide, at the bottom of the slide, they look completely different in this one, right? And it's not really something that you have to use out of the box. It's something that you can modify yourself. So you probably have millions of different configurations that the malicious actor can use. And you can't really design a standalone signature for, to include all of them. So you have to have different approaches to identify this kind of malicious traffic, be able to detect it and stop it. So next, we can see a Wireshark view of the Cobalt Strike DNS traffic. As you can see, all of the data just using the DNS protocol, right here, right? And in this case, they are kind of like for demonstration purposes, they were used like all types of the encoding, but usually what you see in the real attacks is that this is just the initial, then they see which one actually getting through, and then they will use the one that is more reliable and requires less activity on the wire to be able to stay undetected as long as possible. So here we can see the DNS beacon queries and replies based on the using the A records as the main mean of the configuration. And at regular intervals, which you can determine in the settings, so it's not one set and go, so you know that if you're dealing with the Cobalt Strike beacon, you kind of expect it like every 2 seconds or every 3 seconds. No, they actually can modify it within the standalone, or they can modify it with each iteration. So once again, even like some kind of like time series analysis can be defeated by complex enough designed DNS beacon. However, in this case, we see that the first response will always be an A record. And that's needed to determine what kind of data payload will be used. Because even with the Cobalt Strike framework, you can't overcome some of the basic features. And one of them is that initial identification of the buffer of the data that will be used in the attack. Without knowing the buffer data, you can't really carry out the rest of the actions. However, if that one passed, and if you deal with any kind of the network traffic analysis, that's pretty benign. You just see one DNS request and you see an IP address, what you will kind of expect from a normal DNS resolution. What you might miss is actually that tells the team server how big chunk of data it needs to expect to decode it. And in this case, they are using the A records. And then if we look at the subdomain structure, the start of the first subdomain will be the beacon identification, or BID they call it. And this one is actually needed for team server to identify which beacon is actually being able to get out of the network. So once again, you can deploy multiple beacons, and then based on the ID which you get on your team server, you will proceed with the proper communication method. So next one is the possible DNS beacon replies. So here we can see that you can choose any modes that are configured by default, and either DNS with TXT records, something that Chashel was using, or quad A records. Next, we'll take a closer look at one of the TXT query records. It's very familiar. As I mentioned before, it will start with the first response, which represented as the IP address, but after a series of the encoding and decoding on the team server, it will identify the buffer of the data which team server expected to get from the compromised network. I noticed that the start of the query now is just API. API tells the, or whatever subdomain they choose for TXT-based communication will be understood by the team server, and then they will expect TXT records to contain the data that they need to decode on the team server. So the value of each TXT record is the base 64 string that needs to be concatenated before decoding. In this case, it's only 64 bytes, but it can go up to 128 bytes. And then it needs to understand how to concatenate the data, and also it needs to avoid caching by the local DNS resolver. So to overcome them, they implement a counter, which you can see as the, in this case, 1, 2, 3, 4, like second level subdomain. It will be increased every time and the sequence is increased, and then on the team server, you just put them in the right order to get the full message. Next one is, and usually what we've seen is that malicious actors love to rely on the TXT record just because how much data you can put in a single message. However, a lot of the products are able to identify encoded data in the TXT messages, and that communication will be blocked. So the next attempt will be DNS queries. So in this case, once again, the first one is the IP, which represents the amount of data that will be communicated on the wire. Then we have a label, which in this case is CDN, to show that the payload will be within the A record. And then the rest of the subdomains will be kind of the same what we've seen in the first one, where you have the counter, the BID identification, and the data which will be encrypted within the A record. And the last one is the quad A, this one is actual beacon sending results to the team server with the DNS output. And in this example, the query starts with the top label post of the post. And then all of the, and the data will be transmitted with, once again, a unique hexadecimal counter, just like any other queries we've seen before. And then at the end of the, at the bottom of the screen, we can see how the name breaks down on the team server. So the post is the type of the query output we expected. 140 will be transmitted data. Another subdomain is the counter and random number, then our beacon ID, and then the domain chosen by the operator. So this is great. Now we have the idea how different malicious tools are being utilized within the attack framework and how their DNS traffic looks. So in this case, we want to apply several approaches. The first one is kind of like whitelisting approach. That's where we want to block any domain that we don't really have any prior knowledge about. As you can imagine, this is very complex approach. If you just put it in place and just let it run, it will acquire tons of FPs and your customers probably will be crazy. However, if you have a good understanding of your network and you know what critical parts of the network have specific DNS-based activity, you can apply it to the segmented networks and then only block it to, let's say you have a server which only purpose have updates for several software stack that it uses, right? So while you can study it and identify those regular DNS requests, anything that will be derived from that or different from what you've seen before will be blocked and passed for the inspection. And inspection can be done either by automated engines, or you can actually escalate it to your SOC analyst who can make a much more informed decision. So with this approach, for example, we got a domain that was identified as newly seen, and then we pass it for the inspection to our SOC analyst. So what usually SOC analyst does, it looks at the open source intelligence. One of the biggest repositories of such intelligence is VirusTotal. But in this case, VirusTotal has no idea what this domain does and what it represents, so it just marks it as, no security vendors flagged it. We visited it 11 days later, and we can see that only, I believe, 8 different vendors flagged that domain as malicious. However, during our investigation, when we visited the domain, we were able to download the file. We run files through VirusTotal once again, and we see that, well, 3 engines are able to detect it as malicious, which means that if you use any other engine in your network and your user actually visited that domain, most likely that payload was able to execute, and now you might have problem in your network. And if we run that payload through the sandbox, we can see that it is actually a bazaar backdoor payload, which is often associated with the ransomware attacks. So this kind of the category, we developed and called it as newly seen domain in Cisco Umbrella. You can just call it new domains or new domains for your specific segment of the network, and it can be incorporated into more broader analysis, right? So if you have some kind of the tip engine, which makes a decision of what to allow, what to block, something that being downloaded, launched, or retrieved from this kind of newly seen domain should probably be blocked and inspected either by automated engines or by a SOC analyst to have a much better decision-making process. So the next step is actually design the detection for the DNS tunneling. So as we've seen before with out-of-the-box solutions, not that many of them actually designed to identify malicious payload within the DNS record. So you have to build something that will be able to identify it just with the data on the wire that you can get from the DNS query. So you can use three different approaches, right? One approach is what we call the reactive, right? So you collect the logs from your recursive DNS resolver or any other means that you like more to to use, and then you run a series of your algorithms that will detect which domains are more or less likely to be DNS tunneling. While you are not using it proactively, so some communication can get through, at least you can identify that something in your network exhibits this behavior, and you can launch the right way of the IR. However, the better way to do that is what we call real-time blocks. However, real-time blocks will require some kind of the security solution or the actual resolver to be able these decisions, on the fly. So what you do is that after you inspected, let's say, open source tools or some proprietary tools or any kind of like DNS tunneling data set, you can derive your signatures and a set of rules that are triggered when a specific combination of data is seen in the DNS query or within the DNS resolution. So this is somewhat complex because it required the prior knowledge of your good data and your bad data. In our case, we designed it kind of like a modular approach where you have a set of rules that are easily expandable, and it also can work a little bit better with a little bit more complex identifications, something like a Markov model. So you can deploy an algorithm that looks at the data which being run within the query resolution pattern, and then try to predict how big of a chance that that particular data is contained actionable data in terms of if it can contain payload. So if you would tasked with designing this kind of defense, where do you start? So as I mentioned before, the best place to start collecting the data is your recursive DNS resolver. And then what you want to do is that you want to go out there, identify the open source tools for either DNS exfiltration or command and control using the DNS as a covered channel, right? So you run the tools, you collect the data set that you will be analyzing. The second approach that you want to do is identify encoding techniques. Would it be base 64, base 32? And then you want to be sure that whatever you're designing not just looks at the subdomains, but also looks as a different query characteristics. Would it be Q-type like TXT, SRV, MX, or CNAME? And then with that data set, you apply some informational theory, trying to identify encoded or encrypted data, and then make a decision. So in the case with Cisco Umbrella, the way we actually implemented this kind of protection is within the resolver. So what we did is that, we had this, they call it like smart cache for a while. But basically, it's just the technology that let us cache frequently requested DNS records and then build the pairs of the request and the response. And then when some of the trigger rules are actually within the resolver are triggered, the resolver start looking not in just one pair of the resolution, query, response, it actually looks at the whole session of them. And as it looks at the session, it can apply more and more deeper inspection. Would it be based on the behavioral characteristics of the pattern or the signatures that we implemented? And when one of the resolvers is actually able to identify such, which means able to identify DNS tunneling in the process, it actually flags it, blocks it, and then puts it upstream so it can go to the whole fleet of the resolvers everywhere in the world. So being able to identify maliciousness at the DNS layer is amazing. However, malicious actors and their TTPs are consistently evolving, and to be protected from the ransomware, you have to apply approach where you look at your network layer by layer, and then at the proper layers you apply proper security controls and make sure you can detect all of the TTPs that are used by malicious actors, either using your own threat platform or open source intelligence or the knowledge that's gathered by your SOC team. And now I will take your questions.
Thank you, Artsiom. Yes, we have a microphone over there and one here. Who will ask the first question? I have 5 minutes, time enough for a couple of questions. Anyone?
Well, if you don't have any questions right now, you can follow me on Twitter. I believe my Twitter handle should be somewhere in the marketing. And yeah, you can reach out on the Twitter, probably will be the fastest way, and I can answer any questions you might have after some time.
Yes. Okay. Let's thank Artsiom once more. Give him an applause for this interesting presentation.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Having me.